All right. Well, good morning, everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started. This is Sandy Barua from the Detroit Regional Chamber, and we're so glad that you've taken your valuable time to join us this morning. We are so proud to host these Michigan Restart sessions for businesses across the state to give them the information that they need to restart their businesses and start thinking about what a new normal is going to look like for yourselves and for your businesses and for your customers and your clients. To learn more about future restart sessions or to review past restart sessions or our previous Teletown Hall series, please go to detroitchamber.com/COVID-19, and that information will be available to you. So thank you very much for joining us. Today, we're very pleased to welcome three of our friends from EY. The office managing partner for EY Detroit, Angie Kelly, is with us. Good morning, Angie.
Good morning, Sandy. Good morning,
also
everyone.
Joining us is Scott Mullan, who leads for EY nationally, America's Physical Return and Work Reimagined leader and principal for the Advisory Services Division of EY. Scott, I'm not sure how you fit that on a business card, but we're thrilled to have you.
Yeah, it's a lot. Thanks for having me, Sandy. Good to see you again.
Good to see you again, Scott. And Sean Wessman, who's also with America's Physical Return and Workplace Reimagined, Command Center leader and principal, also in the Advisory Services Division of EY. Sean, thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much, Sandy. So nice to talk to you and the entire chamber.
Great. No, we welcome you all. I am so pleased that Angie, Scott, and Sean are all based here in our Detroit EY office, but they are leading national practices around this thought about how we need to be thinking about our office space differently. And with that, I'm going to be quiet because you did not tune in to listen to me, and I'm going to turn it over. I think, Scott, you've got the lead for this first section. Is that correct?
I'm actually going to let Angie kick us off, but I'll be driving slides, so you can blame me for anything we do wrong on that today.
Okay, I'll turn it over to Angie, and I'm going to go off camera, and thank you all again for joining us.
Thanks, Sandy. I'm Angie Kelly, as Sandy mentioned, and I'm the office managing partner of EY Detroit. I'm also on the board of the Detroit Regional Chamber, and appreciate the chamber bringing us together in this virtual format to discuss the most important issues that you're facing in your business. During this pandemic, we've had a chance to connect with business and community leaders and reflect on the future of work. And as Michigan begins to ease restrictions and organizations prepare for their physical return to work, a number of considerations must be taken to ensure a safe work environment. At the same time, businesses need to also consider how the impacts of COVID-19 will transform the way we work and do business in the long term. On a recent EY webcast, we surveyed more than 6,000 executives, and 63% of those executives indicated they were focused not just on a physical return to the workplace, but are also exploring ways for long-term transformation. 71% of those executives also said that enhancing their health and safety measures is currently their primary challenge. And we believe that with the right approach, organizations can position themselves to manage the safe transition back to work, address health and safety concerns, and emerge ready for growth. And I'll turn it over to Scott to discuss that approach and our physical return and work reimagined framework in more detail.
There we go. Got the slides working. Good morning, everybody. Angie, thank you. It's fantastic to spend time with everybody today. As Sandy mentioned, Sean and I have had a fantastic opportunity to lead not just the teams here in Detroit, but take an active role across our Americas team in what we're referring to as physical return and work reimagined. And we'll talk a lot today about what we think in terms of that reimagined space. First off, though, it's fantastic to be here to share and just to continue what I think has been an uptick in sort of just corporate sharing. If I go back many weeks and probably even a couple of months ago now, great companies like Lear and Aptiv and companies in town started sharing their operational playbooks. And there's a lot of content out there. There's fantastic resources. So I would ask today during the call, certainly ask us questions, but at the beginning of this, You saw our pictures and our contact info. If we can help throughout the process, companies big and small, there's amazing levels of resources that I think all companies are putting out and sharing. And I think in that spirit, we hope to share a few thoughts and ideas today that ideally can help you both with the physical return space and the Work Reimagined. And what we're going to talk about is the idea of two gears, two complementing gears that accelerate your transition, that accelerate your businesses. The first gear is really around a trusted transition, getting people back into the physical space, or in many cases, transitioning to a more permanent virtual work environment, depending on where they're at and what's important for your companies. The second is a future-focused transformation and thinking about that future. I heard a great line the other day that if you think about the number of people officially responsible for getting the health and safety and planning the return to work, really a small percentage of our employee base across a lot of companies. Everybody's worried about it, everyone's thinking about it, but it's really a very small percent of people that are really focused on that physical return. Most are running the business. Most are still working very hard to continue to transition us into the future. So having a plan for how do we maximize the work that they've been doing and thinking about what's next, the new, there's all kinds of great ways of describing it, the new normal, the new abnormal, however you think about that, getting out ahead of what we need for our employees, getting out ahead of what we need for our companies, and absolutely getting out ahead of what we need for our customers. Today, Sean's going to spend some time talking a little bit about why we think this is important, and this Work Reimagined point of view is critical. He's then going to dive into what's next for that command center that you set up, what's next for that set of resources that dove into responding to the COVID crisis, and where do we see them playing a role, a very active role into the future here. And then I'm going to spend some time on the health and safety front, and one of the hottest topics that everyone seems to have questions on, we'll dive into, and then wrap things up with a discussion of what's important to that next set of customer discussions. How do we engage with our customers? How do we get out ahead of that future? And again, the new normal, the new abnormal, however we think about that. So looking forward to spending this time together. Sean, I will transition it to you to kick us off with a little bit of the why, and I'll be back in a little bit to talk about a few of the different solutions.
Yeah, thank you, Scott. Thank you, Angie, and hello again to everybody. It's great to be able to share experiences with you. When you look at this slide, I imagine that many of you look at this slide and see a familiar story. We've been living through a period of response and adaptation, and the challenges and quite frankly, the successes of many organizations to adapt to the pandemic and safely accommodate their employees while performing the work of their business has been very good. And we see that captured on the left of this slide. Yet we find ourselves at a difficult point where we must transition back to work, both mentioned by Angie and Scott. And as difficult as it was for us to step away from the work sites, it will be undoubtedly more difficult for us to return to our work sites. And during that transition, we must be aware of the way we perform business, or the business of our business will not be the way that we perform the business of our business going forward. And I know that this chamber has been briefed by other companies as well. And you talked about things like changes in expected safety protocols and employee behaviors, things like distancing while at the work site. Yet, as Scott said, the problem is both safely returning to the physical work site, but that's just the beginning. It's also ensuring that we operate the business in a way that will be resilient to this pandemic and future events like it. Moreover, it must be resilient to the changes that are already underway to our businesses and the ecosystems with which we operate. To me, the gear analogy is perfect for our state and city, because what is it that a gear does but applies a power source to a particular aim or objective, right? And so in this case, gear one is about placing people safely back into their enterprise and performing the essential work, while gear two is about changing the businesses we work in to ensure they are aligned with what we believe the changed world will become. We show the effort of gear one and gear two staggered, but then overlapping. And that's because our experience in the real world has indicated that our clients did begin working on putting people back into the work site first. But as we work with them and as they have their own points of awareness, what we're seeing is that these things have to be done in parallel. And you cannot wait to return people to the work site and to the workforce performing the jobs that they did before, only to then begin imagining what the workforce as well as the business of your business will become. So if we talk about this for a second, or maybe we can dig into gear one, we want to take thoughtful steps to return to the workplace by thinking holistically about operational continuity, where we consider technology, security, productivity, wellness, and engagement. And three things to point to here, although there could be more and we could debate and discuss these, but one is we need to consider the policy, the health and risk scenarios to develop a comprehensive, prioritized and sequenced plan to return to the work site. Two, we need to take actionable steps to ensure the safety of our employees and customers as they engage in our work site. And three, we need to ensure operational capacity across processes, space, technology, and people. And how do we do that? Well, what we see is that our clients, in addition to the playbooks that are being published publicly about the protocols that they'll follow for maintaining social distance and space within the work site, they need to establish a set of criteria that enables them to determine when they can return who and to what work sites. And we've been developing those with our clients. And I'd encourage you that if you're interested to match your own criteria, reach out to any of us. We'd be happy to share it. We are sharing it into our customer and to the broader ecosystem in the spirit of everybody's interest to get back to the work site. But what we do is establish the critical criteria, work with our clients to identify those that apply to them, identify the data that enables a decision, and then model it against their work site and their individuals. At the end of this, you have a defensible decision that's aligned with many of the broader going-ons within our ecosystem. The second, gear two, is about capitalizing on this moment to reimagine your organization. It's about approaching this event as an inflection point to redefine the way your organization operates, right? So one, we need to understand the long-term behavioral impacts of COVID-19 on our customers and their habits and the resulting impacts that that's going to have on the markets you play in. Two, we need to identify the vulnerabilities highlighted by COVID in your operations, your processes, your technology, and prioritize a digital strategy that can help you be more resilient in the future. And three, we need to hit a reset on our market brand through thoughtful actions that provide value to customers, employees, shareholders, and communities. So these are some of the high-level themes around gear one and gear two. But as you can begin to imagine, we really need to be doing these things in parallel to become the business that we want to be. Scott, if we go to the next slide, please. This slide I find is very important. It tells a really important message. There are two critical curves on this slide. The first, in a very macro sense, is the post-economic macro growth trend within the United States or world more broadly at a very macro sense, post-World War II. And it shows continuous growth in the decades that followed. We find ourselves in that period sort of in the center, and we've called it the pandemic reset. And the pandemic reset serves as a period in which many organizations will drop, and some could be precipitous drop, only to have to grow from a point of compression relative to where they were pre-pandemic, and then have to grow. The reason that we want to do a gear one and gear two approach is that we want to minimize the precipitous drop of the pandemic reset to our business and our constituents largely as much as possible, and take the actions that help us move to a position where we join the economic growth curve, having already positioned ourselves up on the upswing, right? So that's at a macro level what we're trying to do, and why it's important not just to be tactical during this period, but to be strategic. The center of this is really designed around this idea that we need to put humans at the center, and we've seen the importance of people as we work through this pandemic, and their importance is only more so as we reflect on the strategies of the future. We need to make sure that we focus on technologies at scale. We've seen the implications of when technology works at scale, this being a wonderful example of some of the remote collaboration. And three, we need to be able to innovate more broadly for our enterprises to succeed. We found that working with our clients who've adopted a strategy of this approach prior to the pandemic, one, they were very resilient. They have been very resilient during this period of the pandemic. And two, they're already positioning to emerge from from our current situation stronger than before. And so we'd encourage you to consider these as you work through your pandemic response. Scott, if we go next slide, please. So now the command center, this is a function that I've been leading now since February. We've worked with dozens of clients. We originally started engaging with our clients through the crisis response teams or the enterprise resilience teams or the implementation of the pandemic response plans. And these were about having the right people with the right resources to facilitate something that's different. So facilitate operations, not during business as usual, but operations during extraordinary periods like the pandemic. And the function of the command center has evolved over time. And what we found is that in the early days, it was about implementing plans. But as time went on and those plans were implemented, it has been about having a persistent function that can sustain an integrated set of capabilities over time, maintaining the lessons learned and the capabilities of moving from one phase to the other, acknowledging that this entire pandemic will have waves, ebbs and valleys of change, right? And so being able to maintain a persistent command center with a history of the happenings that have occurred within the organization, as well as a view of how to integrate the different components has become critical. Scott has moved to the slide that we use to describe Work Reimagined. I think it's important. There have been many frameworks that your organizations like ours have put out, and they have many moving components. What we've tried to do in creating this view is create the most essential and elegant view of the many frameworks that organizations are using to make decisions during this pandemic. So when you look at this view, you see the way that your decisions during the pandemic must be made in consideration of the surrounding functions, right? And so the example we like to talk about is imagine the commercial resilience of your business. By starting with the commercial resilience and imagining what the market will be in terms of demand for your services and your products in the future, you can begin to establish models, financial models for your revenue and for your cost going forward, which then begin to allow you to have the tools to do the workforce planning, to produce the products and services and answer questions of affordability. And then move into the operational continuity aspects. What's the technology, process, business, manufacturing required to support this changing world? And by looking at these pandemic response activities, both the tactical return to the work site, but also the work reimagined through a lens that connects these integral components with a command center, we're able to create in real time or near real time the connections that are required to facilitate strong decisions and very forward-looking decisions. Go to the next slide, please. As we look at this two-geared approach, I think the important piece that we want to talk about is that the two-geared is really waves. At the top of this wave is gear one, the transition, right? Sometimes I think of those as tactical, but there are very much strategic activities in that, right? When we started at the very beginning of the pandemic, it was about mobilizing a response to the pandemic, standing up your enterprise resilience response functions, implementing your pandemic response plans, having a command center. As we moved down the wave, it began to focus on, well, what will our business look like, right? How can we begin to anticipate? And this is where conversations about workforce began to occur. Did I really need to have all of these people in the in a work site? Could they have been working remotely? You know, and other strategic conversations began to emerge. But then we began to come back up this wave and focus on tactical activities again and start to think about how will we move people back into the work site? What does a work site need to look like as we do that? Only to need to come back down and reimagine the workforce for the future in the lens of the petal flower that we looked at on the past slide. And we expect that this will continue, right? This is a wave that will continue. And though the scale of the waves themselves may change over time, we'll always need to be able to fluctuate between this short-term transition and the long-term transformation that is required for our companies to both address the immediate while also positioning for the long-term strategic implications to our organization. And if I could, I think I'm going to pass it back to you, Scott, but thank you.
There we go. Hopefully you guys can hear me now. Sean, thank you for that. I appreciate the time spent on that and the continued time on the command center. Definitely a critical piece of sustaining this and recognizing that the new normal is likely the need to sustain those capabilities. We're going to shift now into talking about what clearly from what Sean and I spend most of our days talking about, and a lot of time across a lot of organizations, big and small, is really the health and safety side of things. And within that, one of the most critical topics right now is getting out ahead of how are we going to keep track of our employees' health, how we can keep track of their safety. And maybe the easiest way to transition into this is most of you know the topic of contact tracing. Most of you have talked about contact tracing. What we would like to do is propose that we think of that a little more broadly. So let me flip slides here for a second. Make sure I have control of that. Sorry. All right. As a framework beyond contact tracing, all right, what most people think about is the conversations that Apple and Google and the app that you can download as my solution for how do I protect the health and safety and know really how are my employees doing today. What we would propose is don't just pick an app for contact tracing. You have to think of it as a holistic solution around identify, trace, and respond. The identify piece being the upfront components of the testing. So a health check, a self-assessment, potentially temperature scans or even temperature self-assessments within that. And then the diagnostic piece of that, antibody testing and the more medical components of those pieces as the identify phase of an entire comprehensive suite of health and safety and really contact tracing. We'll explain how that fits in a second. The second piece then is the contact tracing and the trace component. So using technology to understand where your employees are and where they've been and who they've been in contact with. And maybe the most important and vital piece of this is designing the response network, designing the response plan. There is little value to assigning an app and starting to take health checks and assessments on employees if there is not a comprehensive approach designed as to what happens when we find out that there is an infection. What happens if we find out that someone has been in contact, even with family members who have come down with the disease and with the infection. So part of the approach that we would like to propose is that we expand the conversation beyond just contact tracing into a holistic look at identify, trace, and respond. Let me move beyond the slide for a second. There's a bit of a maturity model to this. And if we think about organizations large and small, the largest organizations, the most financially stable, are going to be able to throw a lot of technology resources at this type of a problem. They're going to be able to go out and acquire technology to trace employees, track employees while they're in the workforce and maybe even beyond that. And in combination with public-private sector, there's likely to be a fantastic map of where have I been and who have I been in contact with. But every organization does not have all of the resources and similar capabilities. And so there really is a continuum, we feel, in terms of how specific and how complex do you want to get with the solution. Starting off with very simply, do you know how your employees feel today? And using sort of the chart on the right, the concept of a virtual health check. Many of you have stood up websites or apps or other use of technology. There's a lot of resources out there today. We EY have built a solution called Return to Office Virtual Approver. It's a very basic app that does the health check and various other simple pieces, easy to use, easy to deploy, to simply get started with that first step of contact tracing, that first step of understanding how are your employees doing today. You can layer on the temperature check and various other components of that. But the first step that I think many people are not thinking about, organizations, they jump right to the right side of the equation saying, how do I track within 3 to 6 feet out where have my people been and who they've been in contact with? Step one is simply, do I know how you feel today? And then evolving from there. The second piece is, each of you, most organizations have some badge access, some security function to get into open the door, get access to the building. And within that, the combination of understanding how you feel today, the status of your health, along with, did I come to work today? And if I came to work, was I on the 3rd floor? Was I on the 6th floor? Was I in building A or building B? That begins a profile that allows you to design a response network. Should I find out that you have come in contact or that you have come down with the disease? And and be able to respond and activate from that point in time. So important to start this journey at the very earliest stages and really an accessible point that all organizations are able to think about with the resources that are available today, and starting with that health check. As we continue the evolution, there's a lot of new apps, a lot of technology being put out there with a lot of challenges from a technology, a usability, and accessibility standpoint. But there's going to be a lot of resources developed over the coming months to try and sustain this solution. The first layer of that is using the phone that most of us all carry around in our pockets. With that comes a lot of different unique challenges in terms of, what version of phone do I have and how new is my phone, and do I need to require this for my employees on a device that they likely pay for? But that's the next layer is some level of tracing, tracking based on an application on my phone. And then the more advanced solutions get into contact tracing with tags that I provide my employee, whether it be a badge or a belt. There's a variety of different technologies out there. And then evolving from there into those that can tell me if I've been or am I within a 6-foot radius of someone else within the organization, allowing me to develop a complete and sort of comprehensive solution. But very important, and I think important to this entire conversation, is to think about how to identify and test at the very earliest points, thinking about what is that next step around tracing, but maybe most critical to this entire journey is the response. What is the plan? How will I protect the employees? How will I communicate? And in doing that, one of the questions that I know everyone has on their mind is, what's the answer to privacy? What's the answer to what can I retain and how do I solve that? So a lot of those questions are still being debated and will continue to be challenged, I'm sure, for many months, but something that we're taking a look at and trying to solve for. But what we wanted to propose was a framework that is accessible really for organizations of all shapes and sizes, not just those with the largest workforces and the largest financial resources to be able to apply it. So something to think about for today, expanding on the conversation from just contact tracing to that framework of identify, trace, and respond. The last piece of that, and to add to the collective knowledge base that I think what's fantastic out there is there's a number of resources for you to get started with on your own employee journey. And so a framework and sort of how we start the conversation with a lot of our clients on that employee journey of identify, trace, and respond. But it's important that everyone starts to think a little bit from a human-centered design standpoint. What are the employee journeys? What are those human journeys of my employees who will be at work on a full-time basis, those employees who are going to be there partially, right? So if they're coming in on only a couple of days a week or on demand as needed, the different set of requirements, different set of journey, different set from a health and safety standpoint. And then all the way through the guests, we have to put consultants back in the workforce at some point in time. Very important for Sean and I. So how do you continue that evolution of that journey, bringing customers into your offices? Or if you're retail, how do you get customers back? We're spending a lot of time with a fast food chain right now and trying to figure out how do we make sure their employees and their customers and guests are very safe and very healthy throughout the entire journey and protecting that. It begins with maps like this. And what's fantastic is there's a lot available in the public domain to get you started with your journey and as part of that. So please continue any questions in the chat line on this topic. It's an area that a lot of conversation going on, a lot of different evolution of technology, and that will continue as we see for many months and potentially over the next year plus to really try and solve and address this. Again, back to that public-private partnership. There's a lot that we're going to have to keep an eye on as it relates to our local cities, local governments tied into what businesses are going to need to sustain here. The next piece, and to continue on here, is really then the evolution beyond the employee side and thinking about my organization as it faces externally and thinking about how do you position your organization to expand and build deep relationships with your customers. And in the interest of time, we've shortened a ton of content into a couple of the key pieces to this conversation. But what we would challenge everyone in that Work Reimagined framework, and you think about, I have to reimagine health and safety. In most cases, it's rare that we have clients that would not be reimagining what it means to engage with their customer based on this new normal, based on what we have now learned in customer preferences and the changes that we see coming through. We have to start, and what we always begin with is understanding the human side of this, and maybe more so, and probably goes without saying, more so than any crisis that Detroit has faced in our time. We're used to cycles. We're used to the ups and downs. We're used to everything that happened 10 years ago and the challenges that it presents. But this one definitely is more human in its center. And with that, we must understand the changes to our values, the changes to our customers' values, the changes to trends. My guess is every one of you has found a different way of engaging in commerce, a different way of engaging in acquiring food, going out for dinner, or the new going in and out for dinner, and changing consumption patterns. So thinking about that for our employees, for the employers, but maybe most critically at a time of reimagining and to ensure the profitability and the sustainability of our businesses, what's most important to our customers, and thinking about that framework. So to provide a sort of a comprehensive look at that, we would propose that this is your framework for thinking about that customer engagement. How do you think about your new strategy? How do you imagine and reimagine work and what's important to customer engagement, to those growth drivers, to the customer experience, and bridging what is a new challenge. And I was on a call yesterday with a series of clients, and one of them said, the younger generation doesn't seem to be struggling as much with this virtual engagement and building trust through a virtual world. So this physical and virtual divide, one of the first challenges is how will you sell in a virtual world if you cannot engage directly with your customer? How do you bring people back in a safe way physically? But if that's not an option, if that's not an option for the next 6 months, year plus, what does your business look like, and how does your business adapt to that changing physical and digital component to things? If we think about from a customer engagement standpoint, one of my favorite topics is for many years, Sean and I and a lot of the consultants in the world have said, well, we should move the automotive space to virtual dealerships. Let's advance the conversation around virtual dealerships. Given our city, certainly a very active conversation. It's very, very hot right now. The idea that we need to continue to evolve the entire experience, a touchless transaction at a very complicated ecosystem, but how do we advance that very rapidly, and how do you think about that space? But not just how do you move at speed to do massive transformation, how do you move all aspects of your customer engagement to speed? One of my favorite examples is very shortly after the crisis began and it was clear we were going to have to stay at home, Chiquita. If you look at the bananas that are sitting, in your house from the grocery store, they removed Miss Chiquita from the banana and just said, she basically had a brand that said, I'm already at home. How do you move that quickly? How do you rebrand? How do you take advantage of that to build trust with your employee base, to deliver a message? There's a lot of fantastic examples out there right now that you've all seen of companies rebranding. How do we do that at all levels, at all scales, at all different types of businesses? How do you change to that new market demand, that new customer demand? And lastly, maybe to touch on the customer experience side of things, thinking about both your employee and the engagement side, how do you build a new network of customer experience representatives, customer experience people who are trained in that digital world, who are trained to think about how do I engage, how do I build a personal trusting relationship if I don't get as much time, if I don't get to spend as much physical time with people. So a framework for, again, trying to share some of our thoughts and knowledge across this space, and a framework to think about your customer and the customer engagement in a different way, and really rethink what is that strategy, reimagine what is coming next. And with that significant portion of your workforce that is doing this every day, that continues to work hard to deliver, what is the plan to making sure there is resiliency and stability in your business going forward? So to wrap up and then take certainly any questions as we think about it, a last challenge for each of you, and really to try and think a little bit like a futurist. And we talk about it in terms of the 4 Ps: possible, plausible, the probable, and then the one that most people forget because it's too easy to sort of just scale over and get very excited when you're thinking about a futurist, is the preferable. How do we think about that in the context of our entire business? And how do we capture right now? And one of the things we see some of the leading organizations doing is spending as much time and with focus teams on the physical return, the health and safety, as they are pulling people together and say, what lessons did we just learn? How do we break down silos? How do we move faster? How do we respond quicker? And how do we re-examine the entire business? So point one, go take a look at your entire business. I'm sure you've done that in the context of how do I respond quickly to COVID? But now how do we do that in a sustainable way? The second, rethink work itself. The best example is that I continue to come across is the move to a significant portion of the workforce to remain virtual. And there's an interesting contrast between many of the companies in Detroit and those high-tech companies that exist throughout the world, some of which, and I'm sure you've seen it in the press, have said, we don't need any of our employees to come back to the office. We're good staying virtual for the rest of the time. But what does that mean to your future hiring plans? How do you train people if they're never going to come to the office? How do you even deliver a laptop to them if that's something that they need? And how do I rethink what pieces of work are critical? The other piece that we're finding is some organizations, a lot of manufacturing organizations are finding that for the ones that stayed open and continue to operate, with less resources, they're actually more productive. There's some interesting statistics and data coming out right now that would show that a reduced workforce in some cases and some of the less essential workers drove down some of the productivity. We have to figure out what that really means and how to test that and drive through what the real answers are there. But how do you recategorize what's important and what do we need to rethink within that? And then lastly, and maybe the fun part, Sean and I get a little bit of time every week to just think like a futurist. You know, what's next, what's coming. But what's been very clear, and maybe the change for us is the thinking like a futurist always felt a little abstract, whereas now we've been referring to as the futurist meets the financier, or really the futurist meets the analytic. How do you apply data? How do you apply the science of what has happened, future potential recovery scenarios, future infection scenarios, future thinking around both the applicability of my business to the current market and how do I use data and science to really set stress tests and develop what that looks like. So keep humans at the center, and maybe as a last thought is as we wrap up the formal piece of this and answer any questions, think about customers, think about employees, and from Sean, Angie, and I, we're spending a ton of time making sure we both think about humans and the physical return, but a lot on that Work Reimagined and what's next to make sure that the city of Detroit and the collective teams that we're working with are successful and resilient in moving to the future. So from there, I would be happy to answer any questions. Sandy, you certainly are welcome to join us back. And Angie, I don't know if you've been keeping an eye on the questions in chat line as we go through.
I have. Sean, a question came in on our identify, trace, and respond section on how companies should be evaluating applications with respect to privacy considerations.
It's a sophisticated question and it requires a sophisticated response. So I'll try to do the best I can briefly, but you can always reach out and we can dig into this with greater granularity. But we need to establish the purpose of it. Is it voluntary or is it mandatory use, and the implications of an opt-in model like that. We need to look at each data type that the app collects, and it should be analyzed from the perspective, or is it minimum, right? The legal permissibility and the restrictions on the data. Proportionality, meaning what we collect compared to what its intended use will be. The data quality necessary to support sound decision making, right? And the actions that are informed by the application. And so the last would be that the ability to share data outside of the employee ecosystem and under what circumstance. So there's a lot to consider. So the actual technicals of the app is one part of it. The legal privacy and its intended use implications of the application becomes a much broader question that requires a greater number of stakeholders to make a decision. I think, again, it points back to the need to make these integrated decisions. Using that flower framework as a point of reference, we can bring in the correct points of view in order to facilitate the right decisions from the information that we'll collect from the apps that we implement. And the last thing I would say from a very practical perspective, privacy impact assessment that we're all familiar with, that could become a valuable tool as you move quickly to make decisions about technology in support of physical return work reimagined.
Okay, thanks, Sean. Scott, I know you just commented on some of this, but just how have we been hearing, things that companies are learning in the last few months with employees working from home? What activities have they identified to drive down costs while also, reimagining the new workplace?
Yeah, good question, Angie. Thanks for passing that along, and I'll run through a couple of these. I've got them up on the screen now, so it's easy to answer. Maybe a couple questions, Sean. I'll direct a few to you. Maybe as a starting point before I come back to yours. Absolutely, we'll and I think the chamber sends out the link to the presentation. There's a number of questions on that. We'll definitely share this content coming out here. Angie, on the cost reduction piece of it, maybe there's two pieces that we're seeing. One is looking at sort of just different sources for your resources. The easiest piece, if you think about the virtual environment, if I've moved a bunch of resources in a high cost location that are now virtual, can I rethink my strategy for where I acquire resources from? And do I have a broader base? Do I have a different talent pool? And how many of those resources, if I doubled the number of total resources, but halved the amount of resources that are working full time, do I change my cost profile? Do I change my benefit profile? If we think about just using call center as the example, many of our clients have told their call center workers they can work from anywhere now. You don't need to come into the office, and we're finding you're just as productive delivering from any virtual space. The second piece is that premise of virtual productivity. And one of the keys for us in that sort of physical return piece, as we call it that, it's really a physical get back to the office, get back to the plant, but also a virtual return to whatever virtual normal is now. And you see each of us sitting in our homes here. So what does productivity look like? And how do I improve the technology? How do I ensure something as simple as they have a VPN connected Wi-Fi device to directly get on the network? How do I provide those tech enablement pieces, but also the training, the learning? One of my favorite pieces is the idea of how do I move culture online? How do I build teams that are more productive, that I don't increase cost as part of this? So the cost reduction piece is obviously the standard approach to that. How do I just remove unneeded pieces of the organization? But there's a lot of new things available to companies, big and small, to think about how they source talent, how they build and train new productive teams, high performing teams within that space. Thanks for that question. A couple other ones. Let me pick on these. There's one on the app that I talked about, our return to office virtual approver. We'll send out a link to that. That is a very simple piece of technology to deploy. We'd be happy to talk to anyone on that. As how we think about that is the first step of that identify health check component within an organization. The second one, how are companies handling testing? This is not an easy topic to answer. Every single one that we've talked to is looking at something different. From those that are saying we're going to sort of sit on the sidelines and wait, to others that are, we're working with a couple that are actively saying we're not going to wait to figure out insurance, we're not going to wait to figure out what the standards are, we're going to ship test kits to each of our employees' homes or send them to testing sites to have every employee tested before they come back to work. So there is no standard in terms of how they're handling testing. But what we see is sort of the multi-layer component to that. The health check is absolutely part of the testing, if you want to think about that ecosystem. The temperature scan on a daily basis, you taking your own temperature, or a number of organizations have obviously deployed scanning technology, thermal scanning technology at the entrances to their buildings and start to use that as a day-to-day check. Those degrees of accuracy with which that can actually help predict some of the infection scenarios. And then lastly, there's the more comprehensive diagnostic antibody type testing and understanding even the limitations within that. So Julie, thank you for your question, but the complicated answer is it is a massive wide range of things. And then Karen, to your question, adding to that, and I think a fantastic one for the collective audience, the collective chamber to think about, is an ongoing conversation on how we deal with that in a union environment. Obviously, a lot of the companies we have in town are in union shops. And what I would tell you is that for the number of clients that I have union employees, there is the spectrum and the continuum that I talked about earlier on the tracing side, and thinking about tags and thinking about those tags that have the buzzing capability and the vibrating capability to let me know when I'm within 6 feet. There's a lot of conversation around what can we do as a company to protect our employees, to prove to the employees, to the union base, that we're doing the right things and doing the most we can in and around that space at a very tough time. So unfortunately, there's no perfect answer to any one of these things, but something that, sessions like this continue the dialogue and continue to think about how we solve those problems. So, team, other questions you saw out there that we can answer briefly before we wrap up?
I think we are out of time, but appreciate everybody's questions and interest in the topic. We are going to be sharing the materials, and our contact information will be included if you have further questions or want to have additional discussions. But want to thank you again for the opportunity to discuss our framework, and I'll turn it back to Sandy if you have any closing comments.
Hi, this is Kimberly from the Chamber to wrap up today's discussion. Thank you to the team from EY. To all the participants, thank you for your time today. You will soon receive an email from me with a link to today's discussion in case you want to review any of the information that was shared. The email will also include today's materials. Please visit our website at detroitchamber.com/COVID-19 for upcoming schedules for Restart Michigan webinars and our teletown halls, as well as a video of this session, which will include all of the slides. The website also includes more valuable information and data to help your business return to work. Again, thank you for participating in this webinar.
Thanks, everybody.